I asked you for your burning questions on language learning or anything else, and fortunately for me, people actually responded. So first of all, before we get into any questions, I just want to say thank you to anyone who asked a question. Makes this video a whole lot easier and less awkward. Thank you also to anyone who has watched or liked or even subscribed. For anyone who, does anyone hit that bell? I don't know. It does mean a lot. It's obviously early days for the channel, early days for me in making these sorts of things. You never know what's going to happen when you do them. So I am truly appreciative of anyone who supports the channel in any way whatsoever, even if it is just watching a video. In answering the questions that people have asked me, there will be a whole load of links below. I also want to say thank you to, there's a bit I have in my description all the time, which is like support the channel type thing, and someone actually donated some money to the channel, which I was blown away by. This isn't like a, oh, now you can go and do it, just as in genuinely someone actually thought the channel was worth supporting. I hope to live up to your and my expectations as to what's going to happen with all of this, but thank you so much for anyone who has supported in any way whatsoever. So, without further ado, that's enough of an intro. Let's answer some questions. So Rachel says, what made you want to start a YouTube channel? This one's quite an easy question to answer. I really struggled with language learning for ages. Now I know loads of people who watch this channel are already language learners and probably quite accomplished. And I was one of the people who would slightly aspirationally watch people like, you know, Steve Kaufman and all of the polyglots, and it's like, oh right, I just need to do that stuff. And I didn't seem to get anywhere with my Chinese for such a long time. It's like, oh yeah, but I know all this stuff about language learning. Why isn't it that I haven't got far enough with my Chinese? And so I just wanted to help some people, because I'm sure there's some other people who are in my sort of situation where language learning is still a little bit mysterious in that, like, I know I should be putting in some sort of effort, but I'm not seeing the results that I want to get. And I just wanted to help some people who are in my shoes. And making videos is fun, so why not? Hopefully these videos will help at least one person, and then my job here is done. Not done, but you know. Question number dos. Asriel says, I've been wondering about your headphones since they didn't seem to go into your ears. Very cool. So the headphones that I use are some open shock. They're like bone conduction headphones, which is really weird because the sound, it's conducted through your skull. So if you put your finger in your ear, you can actually hear better. I got them because I would be wearing various different types of headphone, and which would necessitate often taking them in or out or on or off, depending on the size of the headphone. If I'm trying to do some stuff at home and listen to some Spanish or whatever, and my wife quite rightly asked me a question about something for this awkward on and off thing. The other, probably slightly more important side of it was I walk the dog every day, and in order to get as much Spanish as possible, I always listen to Spanish whenever I walk the dog. That's sort of one of the things that happens. And if I've got like noise cancelling headphones or even headphones that are in my ear, I can't hear traffic and things like that so much. So it's not a particularly glamorous way of thinking about it, but it's just a practical solution. They're great. I recommend them. I'll put a link below. They are not cheap, so don't feel you have to buy them, of course, but have a look. Okay, next question is Lyra Lee. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. Congratulations on the channel growth, onwards and upwards. Thank you, that's really nice of you to say. I hope you don't mind me asking more than one question. Of course not. What made you interested in trying to learn a second language? Right, I'll start before I read all the whole lot. What made me interested in trying to learn a second language? My other life is martial arts. So I've been doing Chinese martial arts for like nearly 20 years now. Pre-pandemic, would go to China every year and do some training out there. And the initial bit was, I'm going to China, I should learn some Chinese. Sadly, I never got past, I'm trying to learn some Chinese for a long, long time until I started, as I've said on this channel before, reading like graded readers and things like that, and going more the comprehensible input kind of way. And then once I realized that I could learn a second language, you're like, oh, I could be one of those people that knows more than one language. And actually, it's quite simple once you get the habit. So that was it, Chinese martial arts, going to China, and the frustration at not being able to speak to locals and people that I had met many times was a real motivator to be like, I've got really bad Chinese and we've exhausted the 3 questions I can say and can't really make any more awkward chat. Then I wanted to have more Chinese so I could just be like, hey, how are you? I haven't seen you in a year kind of thing. Do you think it's possible for schools in the UK to improve how they teach foreign languages? Yes. The problem is, how do you test what you've done? I think testing seems to be a thing. You want to get some bang for your buck. So I don't know what the answer to that would be, but certainly extensive reading, free voluntary reading, as we often say, would be a game changer, I think. And even just TPRS type lessons are more enjoyable for school students. So yes, this is a simple answer. You have lots of good advice on your channel, but what's your go-to top tip for new learners? Go-to top tip, sounds great. My go-to top tip is just do something every day and try and make it enjoyable. It's going to take a while for you to get to wherever you think you want to be, and that will change the more you learn anyway, but you just have to do something every day. You can't dip in and out. Well, you can. This is down to you. It's your language learning journey. I'm not one to whack my finger and tell you what you should do, but the difference between doing something every day to wanting to learn a language are night and day, completely different. Mimi Kiko says, I have a few. Okay, Mimi, let's see what your questions are. When and how has your interest in languages started? I think we've covered that. Going to China. What the key influences you think? It's fascinating how seemingly insignificant things that happen in childhood can literally change the course of one's life. I'm curious how it was with you. Yeah, the curious thing was I went to get a burger when I was 17, and in the burger restaurant, it's not a restaurant, you buy a burger there was a sign saying Kung Fu and Tai Chi, and I was off to see The Matrix 2, and I thought, wow, Kung Fu, that sounds cool. And here I am, many injuries later. Question number 2, does acquiring a language change you in any way, your personality, etc.? They say how many languages you know, that many times you are a human being. Yes, yeah, I think there is something in the way you perceive yourself when you're speaking that language. So I don't think that necessarily the language that you're learning I mean, obviously learning a language makes you more open-minded, but it's when you're doing output in that language, you have a perception of yourself, and probably influenced by how you perceived other people speaking that language, that makes you, to a degree, act that language. We're all acting in daily life, whether we like it or not. Software, Technology and Engineering, catchy title, asks, where can you get immersion content for an absolute beginner? Story Learning was a good source, yes it is, but other than that, should I find cartoons for 2 and 3 year olds and figure out what's going on? Maybe read books for a similar age group. Honestly, reading the story of the mouse who hid under the house or whatever doesn't seem very appealing. Yes, so this is an interesting one. I think graded readers are super useful. Now, the problem is the quality of the graded reader. You're going to have to try and find something that's like motivates you and is, in your eyes, good enough. You're not going to get something that's going to change your life if you've only got, let's say, 500 characters in Chinese, but you can certainly enjoy an enjoyable story. I know Pablo Roman, who does Dreaming Spanish. I've seen lots of his videos. He mentions about using native content, so like children's books and stories, and working his way up to adult content, and that is done through this kind of immersive type learning where he's getting meaning from the context. You can do that, I just don't find Peppa Pig enjoyable. So Peppa Pig, I know people go on about, it's not something I can watch. I think there is enough stuff for beginners in terms of people doing like acquire Italian, comprehensible French, or that kind of stuff on YouTube. And certainly I know in Chinese, there is a mountain of graded readers when you actually get into looking for it, and probably go through some forums and stuff. And most of those will have audio, and then that audio you can listen wherever you go, and slowly increase the difficulty of the readers you're going through. With Chinese, the benefit is there's something called an HSK system, which I'll probably talk about a bit later. Basically, you can work out exactly which level of book you want to go to, as opposed to, it seems with other languages, I'm not so familiar with their grading systems, but sometimes I just say beginner. Well, one beginner language, or some beginner vocabulary for one publisher will be different to another. And so sometimes you can pick up another beginner book and it's still harder than you expected. So also keep it easy, whatever you're going with. Michael Kobielko, sorry for the poor pronunciation, Michael. How do you go from knowing nothing of a language to getting something usable in your head that you can build on? This is an interesting question because the word usable suggests that, in my interpretation of that, makes me think that usable sounds like output. I'm going to use this language. Whereas when I am, certainly how I'm learning at the minute, I'm just focusing on understanding the message. So I'm not trying to use it. Once I understand the message, that's it. I don't have to do anything else with it. It depends on what stage you want to start speaking. If you want to start speaking early, then you probably want to go more for the sort of traditional language learning route where you sort of learn some sort of grammar, because then you know what word order to put new acquired vocabulary in. But for me, I currently I'm thinking speaking a bit later is more helpful for me, and therefore something usable doesn't really come into the way that I'm looking at things. It's down to you how you want to do it. The other thing I'll say is also depends on how much input you've had. So if you want to think skill building hypothesis and trying to learn how to use a language in terms of the grammar and learning vocabulary, you can speak a little bit earlier on. But if you just want to get some input, the more input you've had, the more immersion you've had in the language, the more you will have something usable. And I'll talk a bit later in this video about my perception of learning versus acquisition. And I think that also has a huge role to play, but that's the acquisition side of it is something that in some ways is out of your control. So that probably isn't a very helpful way to answer your question, but certainly I think that is a different spin on it. Merlin, I'm guessing that is with the numbers. I feel like I'm not really learning a language, but just using Anki every day and spending an hour or two on content I mostly don't understand. After 5 months, Anki tells me that I know around 1,500 words, but it feels more like 500, and it feels like I stalled in making progress for like a month or two. What do I do in my situation if there is anything I can do? Is there anything I can do? I am not a huge fan of Anki, not because it doesn't work. Spaced repetition, of course, works. The thing is, all of these things work to a degree. It depends whether they work for you and whether you enjoy them. If you enjoy them, they're going to work because you get more input and exposure to the language. If you don't enjoy them, you're not going to do them so much, and therefore a thing that you don't do isn't very effective. I have been following Ari, who is now Xiaoma NYC. I've been following Ari since he wasn't Xiaoma NYC. Back in the day, many moons ago, he had his Ari in Beijing channel, and basically he was going on about kind of similar to lots of people who use like the AJAP method, the all Japanese all the time, but he was talking about doing nearly 2 hours of flashcards a day. And then he was in China, so then he has this immersive experience, etc. What's interesting is I saw an interview with him and Ollie Richards, and he was saying that what a missed opportunity of being in China, spending so much time on flashcards as opposed to just immersing yourself in the language. I think immersion, we have to be a bit careful because from my perspective, it needs to be comprehensible, otherwise it doesn't count. You can get a sense of the language in terms of intonation and stuff, but you're really not going to pick up much new vocabulary if you don't understand enough of what's going on, and you're really not going to get much grammar if you don't understand all the vocabulary, what you're hearing. Ari was saying he wouldn't do flashcards now. He might do some kind of spaced repetition. Not that Ari's watching this, but if he were, let me know if I'm wrong in the comments, mate. So I think you're better off doing, especially now that you've, in theory, got 1,500 words, or whatever language you're using, well, why not go and start looking at graded readers and then listen to the audio all the time. For me, I think reading the graded reader will help you uncover these words which you've supposedly learned, but now seeing them in context will help you a lot more, I think. And then just because listening is so easy, you just need to get a ton, and sometimes finding good listening material, that's the problem, right? But you can listen all the time. Next question. John Brute asks, how would you go about learning a minority language such as Welsh, where resources might be somewhat scarce? Great question, John. I like it. At some point, right, so I have no desire to learn a million languages languages, sorry, and speak them all terribly. But now that I'm like, oh, I can learn a language, I might learn a couple. English, getting the hang of that, sweet. Learning Spanish at the minute, probably stick on that for at least another 6 months so that I like to think, okay. And then I'll go back to my Chinese. Then the plan after that, this is now years down the line, because I'm not going to dabble when I'm doing these languages. I'm going to wait until I'm at a sufficient level. But at some point I would like to learn French, because France, from my house, it's right there. Right there. But after that, and probably the last language I currently feel any need to learn is Irish. My granddad was Irish, and I would like to learn Irish at some stage. So I know it's slightly less of a minority language. It is used a bit more, and there are more textbooks and stuff for it. So not quite the same, John. I appreciate that. But that's my plan, and so it will be interesting when I get there. I think it's difficult. I'll be honest. It would probably be a good idea to try something like crosstalk, where you find a speaker of that language, depending on where you are in the world and where speakers of that language are in the world. If you're in Wales, go to the pub, buy someone a pint, speak to them for half an hour. They can speak to you in Welsh, you can speak to them in English. If you're not in Wales, then you might have to find someone online. But I would probably start off with crosstalk or something like that, as well as, you know, if there are any, if it really is a minority language, you're probably going to struggle to get any stuff that's worth learning from. You might have to then go to children's stories or like nursery rhymes or something like that. The language, even in a nursery rhyme, is still going to be quite complex for a beginner. So crosstalk is probably the most enjoyable way to do it. It might not necessarily be the cheapest, because you are paying someone for their time. Personally, that's where I would start, because it is some meaningful, comprehensible input. Howard Watts asks, it feels as though my brain is never going to naturally understand my target language, and it'll always struggle. Is this the case? And if not, what can I do about that? Howard, I know the feeling. With Chinese, it was just like, I know all this stuff. I feel like it should just be in my brain, but it's just not. What am I missing in this puzzle, which is sort of the inspiration to sort of start on this language journey? Your brain will figure it out. I don't want to just tell you what you should do, because a lot of this language learning stuff is finding out what works for you, and there might be things that I say and do that don't work for you. I think the biggest thing as language learners is this kind of taking personal responsibility and not being like, oh, well, I tried that and that doesn't work, I can't do it. You're like, well, okay, I'm an adult, I'm going to figure this out. I'll try this method and I'll give it long enough to see if it works, and then I'll try something else. See what works for you. In how I feel about things at the moment, I'm going to say just huge amounts of input will help. I'm not saying that you have to ignore everything else, but if you get lots of easy input, your brain is going to start to figure out the language and get a feeling for it, what sounds right or wrong. Christine Hayden says, hello Christine, you've commented on loads of things, I appreciate you. I'm acquiring French the natural way. I like the sound of it. I'm a huge fan of Stephen Krashen. Lovely. Should I try not to translate when I'm reading, or will it just naturally cease to happen? I love your work and always look forward to your post. Ah, Christine, you're great. The translation acquisition thing, it's really, really interesting. Many times I've signed up to Link. So Link is Steve Kaufman's site where you can read stuff. I'm not sure about copyright sometimes, but you could read stuff, touch a word, get the translation, keep reading. What I found recently with Spanish when I've been reading it is often, especially if a text is harder than perhaps I should have gone with, I'm like, oh, well, I'll give this one a go. I then end up relying on the translation, and you end up looking up words, and part of the nature of that app, if you haven't used it, the words are like colored. So like if you haven't seen a word before, it's blue, and there are different ways you can get rid of that, but often you end up touching the words to sort of change the color on them to be like, oh wow, that's like a word I'm learning. And then it forces you to look up words all the time, or you could just swipe the page and all the blues go away, but then all your numbers at the top don't make any sense. They wouldn't be very accurate. The numbers at the top mean how many words you've learned, for example. So I found myself like learning or translating all the time. It felt like I was moving away from Spanish. I'm using this ALG, this automatic language growth stuff at the minute. Yeah, it felt more like I was going back to translating all the time, which I don't want to, just because of this method, I want to try and stick to it. And so, whereas if I have a book, I can just enjoy the book and get a feeling for the language, providing the book is easy enough. And that's the difficulty of often. But if the book is easy enough, I can then pick up just how the language is just through exposure. I'm not saying you never look up words. I think some people got a bit confused with me talking about comprehensible input in a previous video. If you have only tried the skill building hypothesis, use comprehensible input, give that a go. But what's interesting is the whole acquisition versus learning. So I then went on and got some comics, and right, I'm not a big reader of comics for adults, but what was interesting, because I had the visual cue and fewer words on the page, actually I could quite easily follow this story and what's going on without having to like translate so much. So I have no problem with translation, but if you rely on it, you end up with this vocabulary that is sort of a step behind, and you're always relying on words that way instead of just the words just being there because you've heard them, 1,000 times, for example. You're like, well, I just have an intrinsic sense of that word, instead of, oh yeah, I remember when I looked up that word and that was this. Try not to look up words all the time. You can look up words, is the short answer. John O'Neill says, hi Matt, I understand why people learn a language if required for work or if they live, move, holiday in a certain country, but how should people choose a language if seeking only the pleasure of doing so? Interesting question, John. If you've learned a language or you've got to a degree in that language, it takes a fair bit of effort, regardless of how easy that language is if you're an English speaker or whatever. The biggest thing, so we know it takes a lot of time. So the biggest thing then is what language can you stick with for a sufficient amount of time in order to reach some sort of level in it. And therefore, it then becomes this really cool thing where you can travel the world from the comfort of your sofa. There is so much stuff online now that you can experience new cultures and things like that without even having to leave the house. So it's kind of like, well, where do you want to go? What culture interests you so much so that you would spend 1,000 hours of your life acquiring that language, learning that language, whether you want to go with that, and that is probably a more interesting way to think about it, as opposed to just picking a language out of a hat. Fine, but is there something about a language, or maybe even a script? Is there something about the Japanese, the Arabic, the Chinese script that you go, oh, there's something about that just appeals to me? Maybe you can't articulate it, but you have to have some sort of hook where you're like Chinese. I was going to go to China to learn Kung Fu. I was going to see people in China, and so I wanted to have some kind of conversation. Ted's Assassin. Oh, Ted. Ted's Assassin asks, I have a few questions. First one, what's your opinion on the CEFR levels? Do you consider B2 to be fluent? Obviously not native. Well, Ted's Assassin. We'll say Ted. No, Ted's Assassin. You're killing Ted. Oh, bloody hell. So, I'd probably say B2, that's native. I like Ollie Richards' pub test. I've heard him talk about this in his videos before. I can't tell you which one. He's got loads. One of them, where he was saying about the idea, can you go to a pub and have a conversation with someone where you don't have to alter your speech too much, you can understand them, they can understand you, you can have a good old chat. I think that's a fairly solid test, and that probably falls about B2 in my book. If reading is better than your listening, like me, do you think listening to your target language while following a transcript subtitles is a plausible way to increase the difficulty of the listening input? Now, this is an interesting question, John, because I know this is something that people do, and I've seen some comments kind of alluding to this kind of thing previously on my videos. It's just not something that I do. If I am reading something, the speed of the narrator might be quicker than my reading, potentially, and so that might make some added stress and not the most relaxed way to read a book if I'm just going to sit down. Also, I don't like sit down and study now. There's no like, oh, I've got to get my hour in today. I just get a book, have a sit down, just enjoy reading a book or a news article online or going for a walk and listening to an audiobook. I never sit down and do that studying thing. So that might be another side to why I don't do listening to the transcript type thing. If you want to, you can. I think you'd be better off getting easier material that you can quite comfortably read and then just listen to the audio and listen to the audio all the time, and then you'll be like, oh yeah, and then your brain will just catch up. You might have to have a little bit of ambiguity at the beginning. We have to be comfortable with ambiguity when we're learning a foreign language. That might be the better way to go. Well, what I would do, I wouldn't sit down and read and listen. I would just listen to the easiest stuff that I can stomach. Zest says, when it comes to studying the cases of a language, what is your best suggestion for going about it? I don't. It's not the answer you want, is it? I'm just really enjoying not studying grammar. As I get more comfortable with the language, the grammar sort of reveals itself to me. I'm interested in Spanish, and because Spanish grammar is a bit funky. I can understand stuff when I'm reading it, and well, I don't do so much reading at the minute, but especially when I'm listening to it or watching stuff, I understand what's going on. What will be interesting when I get to the point that I'm outputting the language is, in terms of Krashen's monitor hypothesis, basically, if you learn the theory of the grammar and stuff like that, when you are outputting the language, you can monitor your speech as you're outputting, is the idea. People who are native speakers don't do that because they know the language well enough. But Krashen's saying that as a second language learner, you can monitor your speech to try and make sure it's correct. And if I know nothing of Spanish grammar, I won't have that, but I'll have a feeling for whether it's something being right or wrong, but I won't know because I won't have studied the grammar. So that will be an interesting thing when I get there, and I don't know what I will do, whether I will just bottle it and go, oh, people on the internet are going to watch me speak in Spanish. N. Gabrielle 88 asks, a step-by-step guide on how you go about learning a language day by day. I do something every day, and it's mostly listening, and I aim for 2 hours of listening to Spanish every day. Now I'm now starting to read a bit. I'll read as much as I want, however's comfortable. I don't have a goal for my reading. The main thing is getting input every day, and the way I'm using it at the minute, getting easy enough input so that I can understand new words through context. So through context alone, without having to resort to a translation and looking at words and things like that, so I get that acquisition, that natural feeling for the language. Azriel's back. Do you have any recommendations for good YouTube channels / other resources for learning Mandarin Chinese through comprehensible input? Yes, Azriel. Yes, I do. First of all, big shout out to Yi, my old Chinese teacher, who at the time I'd call Xiaomei or Peng Yi. She's got a channel called Yidiar Chinese, and she's just very engaging. She hasn't put, she's been putting up shorts, but hasn't put up any longer form videos on YouTube for a while, but I will link her below. Such a good teacher, so fun. She was the one who was telling me about the pandemic as it unfurled in China in our lessons, which I mentioned in the previous video, which is like this really interesting. Comprehensible Chinese, that looks like a good channel. I haven't used them yet because I'm not on my Chinese hype, but I like their vibe. Acquire Mandarin is another one. The OG, as they say, and all this kind of stuff, is Mandarin Corner. From memory, I don't know how much comprehensible input stuff there is for beginners. And if you just want some inspiration, just look up Laoma, Chris. He is my language learning hero. So look up Chris and you'll be like, oh, wow, I want to do that one day. Jasmine K, hi Jasmine, says, hi Matt, hi Jasmine. Could you please describe step by step how you would learn Chinese if you would start from zero? Thanks. Okay, Jasmine, let's get into this. This is interesting. Now, in the future, when I come back to Chinese, I'm going to make loads of videos about learning Chinese, I'm sure. The problem with language learning, especially if you haven't learnt a foreign language before, maybe you have, Jasmine, I don't know, I don't want to make any assumptions about you, but just in case, there is so much to take on, isn't there? And if you haven't done it before, you can feel a bit lost and feel like, I don't know if this is working, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, when will I get to a particular level, my expectations are probably ruining the fun here. And so it's useful to have a guide. If you're confident enough in your language learning, you don't need one. My Spanish, I'm just getting input because I'm confident that I know I just need to get loads and loads of input. I can perceive whether it's easy enough for me, and so that's all I need. But especially if you're starting out, having a bit of a guide is useful. I started out with Ollie Rich's Spanish Uncovered, for example, so that was useful to give me a bit of a foothold in the language. With Chinese, what I would do now, if I was starting from zero, I would probably use Chinese 0 to hero from the outset. Now, Chinese Zero to Hero is probably a good one. It starts off like teaching you vocabulary and a bit about grammar because that necessitates it in this HSK series. HSK is 汉语水平考试, which is basically levels in Chinese. And in Chinese, it means that there's like a agreed vocabulary, that if you know this vocabulary, you can read these books, which is super useful. I don't know if other languages quite have that. And so because of that, using a course like Chinese Zero to Hero is useful because, first of all, it feels a bit like you're doing skill building, i.e. you're learning vocabulary and grammar. But the first part is you can access then graded readers. There are graded readers from HSK 1 and upwards. If there's an app called Pleco, Pleco, and through that you can buy graded readers. That's where I would read Chinese as opposed to somewhere like Link. The second part of it, Chinese Zero to Hero, as you move up through the levels, they actually, like I checked out the HSK 5 course, which I'm going to use once I get back to my Chinese. It's all in Chinese, the whole course. And so because of that, it then, for me, feels like comprehensible input because I can talk about language learning terms like we probably all can in our target language. And so all of the vocabulary is kind of comprehensible, but it's being used in different ways to describe different bits. I can't say it's good or not. I'll put a link below just because. I know Ollie Richards has done like a story learning Chinese or story learning Mandarin. I haven't tried it. I thought story learning Spanish was pretty good. I would definitely use that again if I was in the same position. But for Chinese, I don't know how good it is. And I know Ollie isn't a Mandarin speaker, but he's very smart, has a team around him. So I'm sure that's a decent course, but I can't comment on whether that's good or not. Max, hello Max, says, I'd be very interested in how you applied all of this to your Chinese specifically. I think he's talking about input type stuff. I've noticed using massive input in Persian is so much harder than with Spanish. Very, very good video, by the way. Thank you, mate. For my Chinese, spent a lot of time, basically, firstly, not getting anywhere when I was trying the skill building and trying to learn vocabulary and grammar rules. And it was this graded reader approach. And because, like I say, the HSK series, the HSK levels, mean that you can get graded readers from quite an early stage and pick up the language through that way. So that is how I did it. I haven't sat down and watched like an absolute ton of comprehensible Mandarin, comprehensible Chinese, whatever. The ALG method, and I know people have learned Chinese using ALG, which is this kind of approach where you hold off speaking and you get lots and lots of input. And so I'd be interested to hear from anyone who's done that. I haven't done it myself, but when I get back to Chinese, I will probably be doing some sort of similar stuff like that as well. So I can't comment yet. He likes my editing, thank you mate. One more question, did you count your hours in Chinese? I do it with Persian, comparison might be interesting. I didn't count my hours in Chinese, and I think I should have done. I find it so useful when doing my Spanish, and it's a real motivator, but no, I didn't. Next question. Thick Phoenix is back. ¿Por qué estás aprendiendo español? Why am I learning Spanish? Because, Thick Phoenix, my brother-in-law lives in Madrid. His wife is from Madrid, and they have a daughter who's my niece, and I want to be able to speak Spanish so I can go out, and I'll probably speak English to her when she grows up, but that was, my niece is my reason for wanting to learn Spanish, and it's a pretty good one. Next question. Señorita K, Señorita K, don't know. I am learning Spanish by myself with no teacher. Cool, well done. But what I find challenging is creating some structure to learn the language because I don't know where to start. Can you shed some light on this topic? Thank you. So I'm using Dreaming Spanish, which is basically just get loads of input. Get tons and tons of input, and it will track your hours, and the tracking of your hours helps to give you some kind of structure, and then you can look at through that platform. There are other places you can look this up, by the way. This isn't a big plug for Dreaming Spanish. I don't get any money from Pablo. The tracking of your hours is quite useful so that you can look up where you are in this process, and even if you tracked your hours and looked up wherever else online. I think actually if you go to his website, you can probably, I don't know whether you sign up to a mailing list or something, but you can probably get access to this poster which has the levels and where you should be at which particular level. So if you've tracked your hours to say 300 hours in Spanish, where you would expect to be at that stage. I find that gives the structure for me that I need. With Spanish, I don't feel like I need anything else. There's been no intermediate plateau. I'm just getting more input, just understanding more stuff. In fact, I was listening to a podcast yesterday in Spanish for Spanish native speakers that was like, oh, like, I understand this. This is cool. If it's a language similar enough to English, I think you can just keep going, because there are many words that, yes, there are false friends. I do get that, but there are many words that, on the basis of context and how similar they sound to English, you're like, oh, that's the English word, sorry, the Spanish word for this English word. I just get that because of the context and how similar the two languages are. That might be an idea to think about tracking your language. You might have to guess about how many hours you've done so far, and then just keep tracking it. The more input you get, you'll kind of work out where your level is. That provides some structure. So that took a little bit longer than I expected. But last couple of questions. These are kind of YouTube-y type questions. I had a few comments about YouTube-y type stuff in some of my comments previously, and I generally always answer people when they are asking me anyway, but just covering that here. When I make these videos, I try and provide value. Not what I want to talk about, not what I find interesting. How can I help someone? What value can I provide? So if, for those watching that do make their own YouTube videos and stuff, the main thing is, what value can you provide? Make good videos, make videos people want to watch. Anyway, so the last two questions that relate to YouTube-y type stuff. Human Man, okay, says, please make a video comparing the schools of thought of comprehensible input and the silent phase versus speak immediately. Okay, I don't know when I'll do that, but maybe, yeah, at one point. Tutor Asim then says, how did you get 1K subs? I mean, how much time do you spend on each video? I would be glad if you could tell us about it. So my first 1,000 subs were because Laoma of Days of French and Swedish gave me a shout out. One of his videos, basically, he made a video that I thought was quite good, and I could tell because I now make videos about how much effort that would have taken. I told him so. He responded saying, thank you, that means a lot. People don't know how much effort these things take. And then weirdly, then commented on a couple of my videos before he did the shout out. I was like, oh wow, this dude checked out my channel. That's huge, that's great. And then suddenly I, overnight, pretty much got 1,000 subs. What then happened in my analytics, there's this, you can look at your numbers, the behind the curtain of YouTube. It then just plummeted. And then I had to like earn the next, well, I'm nearly there at 2,000. And so that's where we're at the minute. And how much time I spend on each video? Well, this one's taken me so far about just over an hour to film. I had to set up all the lights and stuff. That took me 45 minutes or something. And then this video is straightforward because you've all asked me questions and I've just read them and answered them on camera. But I normally will have some sort of script that I don't do word for word because I'm not very good at that kind of stuff and I don't remember it. But I will have enough of an idea for the video, and I do that in my grey time. If there's a time when I'm like loitering around or waiting for things and I don't have a huge amount of time to do anything else meaningful, I will just open an app on my phone and get typing in, get some sort of script down there before, and then I will refine that over a period of time. I don't know how long that takes because I just do that as and when I get the time, probably an hour, a couple of hours. And then for this video, I probably won't film anything, but then I have to then go and film, and on another day, I then film all the B-roll for the videos that you see, which is hopefully, I think, adds more value to them. So hours. Each video takes hours and hours, and then there's everything else. So I hope this video has been engaging in some kind of way with hopefully providing some value for you all. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate anyone who watches my videos. There's going to be a ton of links in the description below. Some of those are going to be affiliates. I'm not trying to plug any big thing. I'm just trying to answer some questions for people. So I'll see you in the next video, guys. Take care.